whereas in this level, because it's water, you can't jump down from the ceiling. So it became a case of there's a challenge to that the player gets stuck or can find their way onto. They can't opt out of falling on spikes. So it kind of works in an interesting way. So this is things pacing up at this point. By this point, I'm less inclined to give people safe space to learn a new mechanic, because at this point you've been playing the game for a while, you get it. I like to think that the challenges of the game are such that you accept that you're now going to be in danger from this point on. So here is obviously the big introduction of the fact that there can be more than one ability in space. It's important to establish this kind of quite early on, because I didn't want players to get confused by what happened if they had one ability and then they flipped to another ability. Do those abilities get combined? Do they then have both of those abilities? And it had to be a toggle for lots of reasons. It would have been very, very difficult to make levels fun. It would also have been very hard to allow players to disable an ability, which is obviously a big part of some of the puzzles later on. So yeah, with this one, it was really about teaching the player how to logically progress through a space where they had the opportunity to change their abilities, and also how they could combine two characters with different abilities to win. So you have to carry one character on another character here, you have to bounce one character on another character there. It's just a way of establishing that the relationship of characters becomes actually kind of even weirder than it has previously, because whereas before, obviously Laura's ability is static, she's always going to bounce things, whereas here you can kind of tweak what a character is. You can mod characters to be whatever you need them to be, and then that gets piled on with their kind of inherent traits in terms of their size and their jump height to make their own new characters. So there's lots of permutations that happen, and giving that in an environment that's kind of straightforward and kind of a logical linear progression. There's a reason the level's kind of really straightforward in terms of you go from right to left. It's just really simple, just to kind of let players work that out for themselves, but this time in a bit more of a dangerous environment. Establishing Paul as his own character. There's a lot of reasons to do it on his own. Just kind of narratively, I just want to establish him before he's put into a scenario with Gray. The kind of the new mechanic here, gameplay-wise, is the fact that your relationship to the environment shifts. So as you progress through this level, sometimes you can float, sometimes you can't, and those shifts are forced on you. You don't have a choice. And what that does is that just kind of reiterates the fact that shifting can be both a negative thing and a positive thing. And that's kind of important for later, because there will be points later where you have to avoid trigger zones in order to progress and to survive. So here's another example of a level that's kind of intentionally pretty simple, just to kind of allow the player to get used to a narrative point. So this is the point where Gray and Paul meet. The player needs to understand that Gray's starting to be a bit dodgy, and that he's going to betray Paul. That he's going to take all this information that Paul tells him and use it in a bad way. So it's kind of a simple level, but also there is some interesting spatial stuff going on that you have to kind of adjust the positions of Paul and Gray on those steps in order to get the bounce right. There's a few different ways of doing it, but yeah, it's kind of interesting. This is one that there's a lot of little different changes in the way you play this level, and I like that about it. I like that players can find their own solution. this a lot with these two characters. This is a kind of a journey level, so this is really just kind of progressing in a straightforward way from left to right. But hopefully, what I'm going for is that this is actually a really interesting back and forth between the characters. So you're using them and switching their abilities up in order to get them to kind of leapfrog the other character into the position you need them in. So again, this is one that's not so much the puzzle as the feeling of it. And hopefully it's a fun journey. I want the player to really warm to these characters for reasons that should hopefully become very obvious.
Maybe Sam had done the right thing after all. It was getting a bit chilly though.
To add a new trigger zone. So here we have obviously the double jump, which came from Sarah. This is to be honest, again, a quite straightforward environment, but just enough room that the player can work out what it is. There's a lot of communication going on in terms of hopefully explaining to you what each kind of thing does, what each different ability shift does. Obviously the colours are the same colours as the characters they're from. That's something that a lot of people don't actually pick up on. But it's still required to give these environments that kind of act as a sandbox for a player to work out what an ability shift does. Also, it's nice because it lets me do little character moments at the same time as introducing these new mechanics. So this level was came from a lot of different things. There's a couple of different mechanics, or not mechanics, but kind of interactions I wanted to play with here. One was the idea of a challenging trigger zone to get to that then makes the journey away from it easy. So right at the start, that water trigger zone, it's kind of hard to get to. You have to jump across lots of stepping stones with the hazard and danger obviously being water, but then you get the water ability and then you just cruise through the water. And it's a nice moment where you feel empowered. So that's the first thing. The second thing I really wanted to play with was the idea of jumping into a trigger zone in mid-air and then using that ability, falling into a trigger zone and then using that ability which I also do later on. So those two kind of little moments of interaction that I kind of wanted the player to experience. The first one is purely an experiential thing. The second thing is more kind of a puzzle to just work out. That's how you're meant to interact with it. and both of them are obviously used quite a bit later on.
Paul cursed Gray. He should never have told him. He had to get to the other AIs of the world and warn them about Gray. Stop him.
This was one that kind of grew out of the work I was doing on the other levels kind of around it. It's an example of a level that kind of the mechanics are there mainly because I just liked the way they interacted with each other. So there's a lot of really interesting overlapping kind of movements that you're doing in this environment, going back on yourself, using, changing ability mid-air, water not being a threat, because all the water in this level is obviously surrounded in that blue trigger zone. It means that water becomes a buoyant interaction. You actually have to use the buoyancy, I believe, for the first time in the game in order to hit the switch on the right. So there's a really kind of interesting interaction that takes place here that I wanted to play with, and I think kind of is quite fun. love Team Jump. Team Jump, the main purpose of Team Jump was to bring a little bit more humour into the game. I really wanted to have a group of characters who were a bit silly, a bit stupid, to be honest, and a bit fun. The other interesting thing with Team Jump is Team Jump were actually how this game originally was envisaged. When I first started thinking about these mechanics many years ago, I imagined kind of a group of characters all the same that you could basically kind of stack up and make kind of, I don't know the word for it, but those kind of gymnast poses where you stack up a bunch of people on at the same time. I wanted to do that kind of thing with characters in the game. And it kind of, in the context of the game I was thinking about, it didn't really work, but in this context it felt like actually adding a bunch of characters who were all essentially identical, and then getting the player to build them into towers or get them to help each other out became really interesting and became something that was a different style of gameplay. The other characters, because they're all so unique, you kind of think of them as unique entities and use them as such, whereas with these, because they're all the same, I kind of hoped that they would be seen as one unit, and it became a case of almost having a transforming shape character in the game. And I'm a massive Transformers geek, so so that was fun. But yeah, I'm kind of, I feel there's more puzzles to be done with Team Jump. I might have to revisit them one day.
They acted as one. There's a few things going on here that I just think are really cool. The main one, obviously, is there's current to the water. I programmed this into water the moment I made water. It was very easy. It was actually easier to make the water have a current to it and actually kind of pull the player across than it was to make the water buoyant. So they always had a movement to them, but I never really worked out a puzzle that kind of suited it. It always felt frustrating, or if you played with it, it felt like it was kind of helping you win by default. And this was a fun level to make because I got to use that current in an interesting way. So there's points where that current can be dangerous because it can knock you into things that hurt you. But the bit that I really love in this level, and it's something that I had to tweak things a little bit for, was there are moments where in order to win you have to intentionally sink into the water. But because the water has a currency of it, has a current going through it, you're then swept into a trigger zone which saves you, kind of an underwater save, which is something that doesn't exist in the rest of the game. I really worried that players wouldn't get it and they would kind of avoid it because they'd see it as dangerous. But by doing that, it just kind of breaks the mechanics in a really charming way that you kind of have to sacrifice your characters in order to, by default, be saved by that secondary trigger zone. And I'm just really chuffed with it. It came together. It felt really good. It was hard. I had to fiddle with some code to make it work, but it's a really nice moment. I'm really chuffed with. And then that's it really. There's so much going on in this level. It's just it's a very Thomas Was Alone level, and I'm really chuffed with it.
this is a level. This is something that a mechanic that I kind of really wanted to bring in, which is the idea of avoiding trigger zones. The trigger zones become dangerous, just in and of themselves. So here you have, like, right at the top there at the end, you have those blank trigger zones, which are intersecting with the water as you swim across. You have to avoid those in order to not turn away from being buoyant and sink. You have to kind of avoid those. And it was really interesting to take something that the player has up to this point used, basically has empowered them, and then to make that a hazard that they have to avoid. And that's something that can only really be achieved once the players, getting the system, they've been through enough challenges with it, they understand how these trigger zones operate. You can start introducing these kind of abstract repurposing, I guess, of the existing mechanics. So it works really nicely, I think. Yeah, it's fun. And it becomes a little bit Frogger, which is quite charming. As the fifth chapter of the game focuses on the characters kind of being removed one by one, the important thing here was to make sure the game stayed fun and didn't feel like a stretch. We weren't adding any more characters, for example. So this is where I kind of start to play a bit more with the environmental stuff, and I start to try and think about some different combinations of the characters and situations to put them in. The coloured switches, this is the first time they're in the game, I believe. They are there, well, they're there for a lot of reasons. To be honest, they're partly there just for me to cover myself. They allow me to lock off areas and make it so that one character can get somewhere but a second character can't. It's cool from that respect, because it makes puzzle design a little bit easier. And then there's hopefully a few places where that actually kind of serves the player and feels kind of nice and dramatic and more puzzling, essentially. It's a way of managing space to make some new puzzles. This is, much like everywhere else where I've added a new mechanic, again, a safe place. The coloured buttons you're going to work out by mistake, even because they're all there, all the different colours are represented, so you'd have to work very hard not to understand what was required of you in this level. It's hopefully a nice way of introducing that and also kind of getting us started for the kind of the 10 levels where everything goes a little bit wrong. idea, and I do it quite a few times in the next few levels, of environments that are more mechanical. So they shift shape, you press buttons in order to tweak the world around you. It's something I love in quite a few games. And it felt like a nice way of keeping things interesting without having to introduce new characters, as I said before. And also here specifically, I wanted to split the characters because there's quite a few characters at this point. and Thomas is kind of at its perfect kind of balance. I think around 4 characters. So these kind of places where there's way more than that. It felt like they needed to be split into 2 groups, just to hopefully to keep the game a bit more fun and those relationships a bit more understandable by the player. So that's what this level is basically splitting those out, and hopefully the effect that you have in one area with one group of characters affects the other, and vice versa a few times, which is hopefully fun.
Chris was in love, and that was fantastic and everything, but that didn't mean they could let the doom cloud keep following them. Thomas was going to put his foot down once they got to the next level.
The idea, and I do it quite a few times in the next few levels, of environments that are... I really like the idea, and I do it quite a few times in the next few levels, of environments that are more mechanical. So they shift shape, you press buttons in order to tweak the world around you. It's something I love in quite a few games. And it felt like a nice way of keeping things interesting without having to introduce new characters, as I said before. And also here specifically, I wanted to split the characters because there's quite a few characters at this point. and Thomas is kind of at its perfect kind of balance. I think around 4 characters. So these kind of places where there's way more than that. It felt like they needed to be split into 2 groups, just to hopefully to keep the game a bit more fun and those relationships a bit more understandable by the player. So that's what this level is basically splitting those out, and hopefully the effect that you have in one area with one group of characters affects the other, and vice versa a few times, which is hopefully fun.
Chris was in love, and that was fantastic and everything, but that didn't mean they could let the doom cloud keep following them. Thomas was going to put his foot down once they got to the next level.
So Thomas is gone. Hopefully that kind of surprised players because he's obviously the main character. So making him the first character to be removed kind of throws people off a little bit and kind of makes people wonder what's going on, which is cool. I also had to front load in these levels anything I wanted to do with lots and lots of multiple characters because they're all getting picked off. Spoilers. I needed to make sure that anything I wanted to do that had lots and lots of different characters interacting was done right at the start. So this is an example of a level like that where multiple characters are working together in different formations. This wouldn't work later on in the game, so it's a nice chance to play with some of those ideas. So Thomas is gone. Hopefully that kind of surprised. Thematically, Chris had to be taken by the Pixel Cloud on his own. He's going to grow and learn and be a lovely human being eventually. But for now, I kind of felt like it was important that he was still not quite there. He wasn't quite with the others, and he kind of was distant. And I kind of wanted that to be kind of symbolised, I guess, symbolised by the way he goes in the end. And that's cool. And then obviously around that came this awesome idea. I'm doing a lot of very arrogant statements during this particular piece of commentary. The rest of it's all very humble. The idea of him kind of falling through that environment is hopefully quite fun. That's what's cool about Thomas, because the world's so abstracted. I'm kind of free to just do silly stuff that doesn't make a lot of sense. Why would he fall? Who would make a room this shape? Why doesn't he die horribly when he lands? All these kind of questions. But in Thomas, it kind of makes sense, and it means I can do something cool. I'd do a little bit of, technical tweaking just to get the gravity and the kind of the camera working. Anyone who follows me on Twitter will know how obsessed I am with the Metal Gear Solid franchise. And one thing I love, tiny little moment, is in Metal Gear Solid 2, on the tanker. There's a moment where you come up to a corner and you see a guard's shadow, and it tells you that a guard's around that corner. It's utterly pointless because you've got the radar, but it's a really cool, dramatic moment. I remember when I played that game on PlayStation, it was so... It was just innovative. It felt really different and cool and awesome. And I liked the fact that the graphical effect, so the shadow, was actually relevant to the gameplay and actually kind of gave me some information. And I wanted to do that here. So again, shadows, with this level, the shadows kind of act as an early warning system, so you know that something's going to fall on you because there's a shadow being cast. There's no other point in the game where that relationship is quite so specific, but I love it here. I think it works really nicely, and I'm really chuffed with how it came out. opportunity left to do a character ordering kind of puzzle with this and the bouncing before Laura's taken. So I kind of, with this one here, it's interesting. It's kind of, hopefully the geometry kind of misleads the player, and you see a lot of people kind of working on a few different possible solutions before they work out the correct puzzle solution here, which is kind of exactly what I wanted. It kind of, hopefully kind of messes players thinking up a little bit, and it's cool, and I think it works pretty well.
Been the bait. She had a hunch that she wasn't needed anymore.
I like the pairing of John and Claire. There's something quite nice because both of them are awesome and epic in their own fields. It's really nice because you have the ability to have big jumps and big cool moments, and you have a few of those where you jump up very high, and also there's that really subtle, obviously the power of Claire, which she can float. I really love. There's a nice moment here that I'm really happy with how it came out, which is where there's a submerged spike pit, and with a button above it as Claire, so you have to press the button and immediately move away in order not to hit the spikes. It's a tiny moment, but there's something that you haven't seen before, that kind of idea of Claire being in danger because of her superpower. And yeah, I think it works kind of well here. And this level's nice because it's kind of ponderous and it takes your time before the next level where I make people quite angry. levels with a kind of a cut-off point or anything really that kind of forces them to be fast. This is one of them. It was a real challenge. There's not many timed challenges in this game, or levels with a kind of a cut-off point, or there's not many timed challenges in this game, or levels with a kind of a cut-off point, or anything really that kind of forces them to be fast. This is one of them. It was a real challenge. It's a struggle for a lot of players because players try and do it at the same time with both characters, which is very, very nearly impossible. There's not many timed challenges in this game, or levels with a kind of a cut-off point, or anything really that kind of forces them to be fast. This is one of them. It was a real challenge. It's a struggle for a lot of players because players try and do it at the same time with both characters, which is very, very nearly impossible. What you need to do is separate them out. And there's a problem here, I think, in terms of communication, that the player doesn't necessarily understand that they should do that, and will therefore become more and more frustrated repeating the same solution. So yeah, I'm not sure. There's not many timed challenges in this game, or levels with a kind of a cut-off point, or anything really that kind of forces them to be fast. This is one of them. It was a real challenge. It's a struggle for a lot of players because players try and do it at the same time with both characters, which is very, very nearly impossible. What you need to do is separate them out. And there's a problem here, I think, in terms of communication, that the player doesn't necessarily understand that they should do that, and will therefore become more and more frustrated repeating the same solution. So yeah, I'm not sure time puzzles are the best idea in this game, but there's not many timed challenges in this game, or levels with a kind of a cut-off point, or anything really that kind of forces them to be fast. This is one of them. It was a real challenge. It's a struggle for a lot of players because players try and do it at the same time with both characters, which is very, very nearly impossible. What you need to do is separate them out. And there's a problem here, I think, in terms of communication, that the player doesn't necessarily understand that they should do that, and will therefore become more and more frustrated repeating the same solution. So yeah, I'm not sure time puzzles are the best idea in this game, but it works and it feels dramatic, and it's visually very cool levels. So I think it does a lot of things right, but maybe the time element could have been rethought. Never one to underplay anything, I then repeat and do another timed level directly after the one that annoys everyone. which was an interesting choice. This is kind of this is a race against time. You do only have one character now, so it's less frustrating in that sense. Never one to underplay anything, I then repeat and do another timed level directly after the one that annoys everyone. Which was an interesting choice. This is never one to underplay anything, I then repeat and do a timed level directly after the one that annoys everyone. Which was an interesting choice. This is kind of this is a race against time. You do only have one character now, so it's less frustrating in that sense. It could have done with a bigger gap before it, but it works. This also kind of emphasizes John's never one to underplay anything, I then repeat and do another timed level directly after the one that annoys everyone. Which was an interesting choice. Never one to underplay anything, I then repeat and do another timed level directly after the one that annoys everyone. Which was an interesting choice. This is kind of this is a race against time. You do only never one to underplay anything, I then repeat and do another timed level directly after the one that annoys everyone. Which was an interesting choice. This is kind of this is a race against time. You do only have one character now, so it's less frustrating in that sense. It could have done with a bigger gap before it, but it works. This also kind of emphasizes John's, and this is the final moment of that kind of trifecta of mean levels. This one actually was designed to be frustrating, so I don't feel too bad about this one. You're meant to really struggle to get to the exit with this. I wanted John to really fight to escape. Even though, and this is something that happens a lot in Thomas, there's never any choice on the player's part. There's never any ability for you to choose where you're going next, say through a portal. I really liked the idea of creating an emulation of that kind of relationship with the environment. So the idea that John's racing to get away. There's no way the player can obviously get away, but I really wanted them to feel that kind of that stress of trying to succeed. And the main reason for doing that is that then once they do finally succeed, at that point they fail anyway, which is that kind of classic horror movie thing of work, and then fail ultimately, and that's hopefully leaves kind of an uncomfortable feeling. I really want you to feel bad at the end of this level. Hopefully it's built up at this point. You've lost every character that you like, that's been introduced to you. This could very easily have been the end of the game, and I like the fact that the player is going to feel there's a definitive end to this section of the game. So putting these challenges right at the end hopefully kind of achieves that.
John gulped. He knew he'd never escape. He knew it was waiting for him. He decided to jump the massive scary gaps, for old time's sake.
this is James. He's another one of my favourite characters. He's intended to be the opposite of Thomas. He's kind of the anti-Thomas. This is something that lots of games do, and have the negative version of their main character. He's not evil. He's not mean in that way, but he's emotionally, hopefully, kind of the opposite. He's uncomfortable with the world. He's scared of the world. He's kind of he's not a massive. Fan of groups of people either. It's established very early on that he's bullied or he's uncomfortable around others. So hopefully kind of the complete inverse Thomas, which will become interesting when they meet. It's quite nice as well that he's physically the opposite of Thomas in terms of that he falls upwards, that he's got the anti-gravity. It's a nice way of bringing that mechanic in. And then little things like the fact that he's the opposite RGB value, which is a minor little nerdy thing to do, but one person in the world would realise prior to this commentary, and that's important. And that makes me feel clever at parties. I don't go to parties, I'm a game designer. All the characters are different in this game, and that's obviously from a gameplay point of view, that's sort of the point. As the fifth chapter of the game focuses on the characters kind of being removed one by one, the important thing here was to make sure the game stayed fun and didn't feel like a stretch. We weren't adding any more characters, for example. So this is where I kind of start to play a bit more with the environmental stuff, and I start to try and think about some different combinations of the characters and situations to put them